Minsk, 15th August, 1941. A camera captures the moment. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler inspects rows of exhausted Soviet prisoners behind barbed wire at a German camp outside Minsk. Weeks into Operation Barbarossa, German formations have encircled entire Soviet armies. Over the war's course, about 5.7 million Red Army personnel will fall into German hands. By war's end, approximately 3.3 million, 57%, will be dead. Among them, Soviet women, combat medics, radio operators, partisans, civilians swept up in rear area screenings. They move through POW cages, Ostarbeiter labor pools, the women's concentration camp system. German policy denies Soviet POWs Geneva protections. Soviet policy later subjects returnees to NKVD filtration. The Wehrmacht reports only 930,000 Soviet POWs still in custody by January 1945. The remainder, dead, released into labor, escaped, liberated. What happened specifically to Soviet women inside that system? 22nd June through August 1941. Wehrmacht High Command Headquarters, Army Group rear areas stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. A bundle of staff directives lands on a Corps adjutant's desk. Instructions on prisoner of war handling, food allocation scales, segregation protocols. The orders arrive as encirclement battles form across the Soviet frontier. German planners anticipated mass captures. They had prepared processing chains, frontline collection points called Sammelstellen, transit camps designated dulags, permanent installations marked stalags for enlisted men, O-flags for officers. But the directives carried an ideological exception. Soviet prisoners of war would be held outside Geneva Convention protections. The orders permitted special handling of political commissars, party officials, and identified politicals. Ration scales fell below subsistence levels. Shelter provision remained minimal, often open ground, pits, or canvas tents. Medical care, virtually none. Within weeks, field commanders reported reality. The dulags filled faster than anticipated. Captured women appeared in the intake logs. Medical orderlies marked SAN instructor. Radio operators from signals units. Women detained during security sweeps against partisans. By autumn, mortality curves began their climb. Open-air camps offered no protection against rain and cold. Ration scales provided insufficient calories for survival. Typhus spread through overcrowded enclosures. The numbers reflected policy choices, not operational necessity. Wehrmacht quartermasters controlled vast supply networks across occupied Europe. German soldiers received adequate food, clothing, and shelter throughout the winter. Soviet prisoners received none of these. One passage from an August directive read, "The Bolshevik soldier has forfeited all claim to treatment as an honorable opponent." Another authorized camp commandants to separate undesirable elements for transfer to SS and police jurisdiction. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht listed only approximately 930,000 Soviet POWs still in custody. Against 5.7 million captured, the arithmetic exposed catastrophic attrition. Summer through autumn 1941, rear zones across Belarus, Ukraine, Western Russia, later transfer corridors leading toward the Reich. A Dulag intake officer opens a ledger. He records a SAN instructor, medical orderly, captured with her unit near Smolensk, a radio operator from a signals detachment taken in the Kiev encirclement, women detained during an anti-partisan sweep, classifications uncertain, combatant, auxiliary, civilian. German military administrators had expected overwhelmingly male prisoner flows. But German intelligence had underestimated the scale. The Red Army mobilized approximately 800,000 women during the war. Many served in medical battalions. Others operated radios, drove trucks, worked in supply depots, and served in anti-aircraft batteries. When frontline formations collapsed, these women entered captivity alongside male soldiers. Dulag commandants found themselves processing female POWs without clear guidance. The intake ledgers recorded their presence, nationality, military specialty when known, physical condition. Simultaneously, German security divisions swept occupied territories for partisans and suspected collaborators. The operations netted civilians, women flagged for family connections to party officials, for suspected underground activity, or simply for being present during a village security action. By late 1941, the Reich Labor Ministry faced severe manpower shortages. Policy shifted. Orders went out. Soviet civilians would be conscripted for labor deployment in the Reich. The term Ostarbeiter, Eastern worker, entered administrative vocabulary. Women formed a substantial share of the Ostarbeiter cohorts. They were younger on average than male deportees, considered more manageable and deemed suitable for agriculture, light industry, and domestic service. Labor offices in occupied zones received quotas. Local administrators filled them through forced recruitment drives. The boundaries blurred in practice. Female POWs, partisan suspects, civilian conscripts, all moved through overlapping systems toward the same destinations, labor assignments in the Reich, or, for those flagged as political threats, transfer to the concentration camp network. By August 1944, over 2 million Soviet civilians labored in Germany. Among them, hundreds of thousands were women. November 1941 through January 1942. Forward prisoner of war camps from Wietzendorf in northern Germany to Minsk in occupied Belarus. A photograph survives from Stalag XB near Wietzendorf. Soviet prisoners dig holes into the frozen ground. They scrape at earth with bare hands and salvaged metal fragments. The holes will serve as shelter. No barracks have been constructed. Winter has arrived. German commanders had believed minimal provisioning would suffice for Soviet prisoners. The ideological framework held that Slavic populations were racially inferior, their soldiers unworthy of the resources required for Western Allied POWs. The calculations proved lethal. Ration scales issued to Soviet POW camps provided between 700 and 900 calories per day. Medical research establishes that sedentary adults require approximately 1,500 to 1,800 calories for basal metabolism. Men performing physical labor need substantially more. On 700 calories, starvation proceeds inexorably. By December, camp medical officers, where such existed, reported typhus outbreaks. The disease spreads through body lice in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Soviet POW camps met every criterion for epidemic transmission. Death rates climbed through the winter. Camp records were preserved, document the acceleration. In September and October, hundreds died weekly in major camps. By December and January, the toll reached thousands per camp per month. On 15 August 1941, Heinrich Himmler had inspected Soviet prisoners outside Minsk. Photographs captured his tour. Within months, the camps he visited recorded massive die-offs. The mortality was not incidental. It resulted from calculated denial of adequate food, of shelter, of clothing, of medicine. Women in the camps faced additional vulnerabilities. Segregated or not, they endured the same caloric deficits, the same exposure, the same disease environment. Statistical summaries compiled after the war reveal the scale of approximately 3.3 million Soviet POWs who died in German custody. The majority perished between autumn 1941 and spring 1942. From early 1942 onward, a different calculus began to reshape survival probabilities. The Reich's labor shortage forced a policy pivot. January through December 1942, general government territories, Reich labor ministry districts across Germany, a Stalag labor officer receives a directive. It specifies quotas for agricultural detachments and factory work parties. The order represents a reversal. Through winter 1941 through 42, German policy had treated Soviet prisoners as disposable. Now, with German workers increasingly conscripted to military service, the Reich needed labor. In January 1942, orders went out authorizing expanded use of Soviet POWs in Reich industry and agriculture. Camp commandants began sorting prisoners by physical capacity. Those assessed as fit for work were organized into Arbeitskommandos, labor detachments. The sorting process became a life-or-death selection. Prisoners too weak from starvation and disease remained in the camps, where mortality continued unabated. Those selected for labor received marginally better rations, enough to maintain work capacity, if barely. Women pulled from cages and Ostarbeiter pools entered this labor system. They were assigned to agricultural work in rural districts, to textile factories, to light manufacturing. Some worked in munitions production. Domestic service in German households employed thousands more. The labor detachments lived in guarded barracks adjacent to work sites. They wore the OST badge, a blue and white cloth marker sewn onto clothing, identifying them as Eastern workers. Movement was restricted, contact with Germans forbidden, surveillance constant, for women flagged as politicals, a category that included suspected partisans, anyone with Communist Party affiliations, and those caught in infractions such as unauthorized movement or refusal of work orders. Labor assignment was not the destination. They were routed toward the concentration camp system. The distinction between POW labor and Ostarbeiter civilian labor blurred in practice. Both groups wore badges, both lived in guarded compounds, both faced punishment regimes that included beatings, solitary confinement, and transfer to concentration camps. By late 1942, the labor infrastructure was entrenched. Millions of Soviet prisoners and civilians worked across the Reich. 1939 through 1945, Ravensbrück concentration camp, Fürstenberg under Havel, northern Germany. An intake room at Ravensbrück. A female SS guard instructs a new prisoner to extend her arm. She stamps a number onto the skin with ink. Then she hands the prisoner a cloth badge. A colored triangle with a nationality letter. Red triangle with SU for Soviet Union. Ravensbrück opened in May 1939 as a concentration camp for women. The camp served as a central node for political prisoners, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, Roma, and women from across occupied Europe. The camp's structure followed the standard SS concentration camp model. A main camp surrounded by electrified barbed wire, guard towers at intervals, interior divided into blocks, wooden and later brick barracks, housing prisoners, workshops where prisoners labored for SS enterprises and private contractors. Siemens built a subcamp adjacent to the main installation. Prisoners produced electrical components for the company. Other workshops manufactured textiles, processed fur, and assembled munitions. The badge system sorted prisoners by category. Political prisoners wore red triangles, criminals wore green, Socials wore black, Jews wore yellow triangles arranged in a Star of David configuration. National letters identified origin, P for Polish, SU for Soviet, F for French. Soviet women began arriving in significant numbers from 1941 onward. Some came directly from POW cages, flagged as political commissars or partisan suspects. Others arrived via police prisons in occupied territories. Still others transferred from Ostarbeiter labor assignments after disciplinary violations, camp records partially destroyed during evacuations in April 1945, nevertheless preserve rough totals. Estimates place the overall number of women who passed through Ravensbrück and its subcamps at approximately 130,000 to 132,000. Soviet women comprised roughly 28,000, approximately 21% of the total. Inside Ravensbrück, Soviet prisoners faced compounded vulnerabilities, language barriers, limited communication. Stigma from both German authorities and some Western European prisoners isolated them further. The physical toll of prior captivity, starvation in POW camps, forced labor conditions weakened them before arrival. By late 1944, Ravensbrück held over 40,000 prisoners simultaneously, far exceeding design capacity. Overcrowding worsened sanitary conditions, disease spread, rations, already minimal, were cut further. Mortality rose. In April 1945, with Soviet forces approaching, the SS began evacuating the camp. Approximately 20,000 prisoners were forced onto death marches heading northwest. Many died on the roads. Soviet troops reached Ravensbrück on 30th April, liberating the remaining prisoners. 1942 through 1944, industrial and agricultural districts across the German Reich. A factory foreman checks an index card. It lists a Soviet woman assigned to his munitions plant. The card records her name, date of birth, place of origin, work assignment, housing barrack number, and disciplinary notes. By August 1944, Reich labor authorities documented over 2 million Soviet civilian workers inside Germany. Among them, women formed a substantial share. Estimates range from 40 to 50%. They worked in agriculture, textile mills, light manufacturing, munitions factories, and domestic service. The OST badge marked every Ostarbeiter. The cloth patch worn on the chest signaled status: foreign, Eastern, unfree. German citizens were forbidden from socializing with Ostarbeiter. Violations, particularly sexual relations, were prosecuted under racial laws. Living conditions varied by sector and employer. Agricultural workers often lived in barn lofts or improvised barracks. Industrial workers inhabited guarded compounds built by employers. The camps featured barbed wire perimeters, locked gates at night, and routine inspections. Ration scales tied food allocation to productivity. High-performance workers received more bread. Low-performance workers received subsistence levels. Hunger was a management tool. German officials had expected compliant, high-output labor. Reality diverged. Labor office reports noted escape attempts. Security bulletins logged sabotage incidents. Police files filled with cases of work refusal or insubordination. For women, additional vulnerabilities, compounded coercion. German supervisors exercised power with impunity. Sexual violence, though officially discouraged under racial purity laws, occurred routinely. The Gestapo maintained oversight of the Ostarbeiter system. Any perceived infraction could trigger detention, running away, damaging equipment, arguing with a foreman, unauthorized contact with a German. Punishments ranged from beatings to transfer to concentration camps. Industrial demand marginally improved survival odds compared to POW cages. Women in the Ostarbeiter system received regular food rations, however meager. They had shelter. Mortality rates, while elevated, did not approach the catastrophic levels of winter 1941 through 42 in the camps. Yet the system embedded violence at every level: overwork, insufficient food, constant surveillance, threat of punishment. 1942 through 1944, Ravensbrück concentration camp medical facilities. A clinic ledger lies open on a desk. One column records dates, another lists prisoner numbers, a third notes procedures: surgery, injection, transfer. The entries sit adjacent to one another, the routine and the lethal merged into administrative continuity. The Ravensbrück infirmary occupied a brick building inside the camp perimeter. It was labeled a hospital. It functioned as something else. Medical care existed, but selection operated alongside treatment. The infirmary sorted prisoners into categories: those who might return to work and those deemed unproductive. SS doctors and medical staff implemented policies that merged labor exploitation with eliminationist logic. Prisoners too sick to work faced special treatment, a euphemism for killing. Some were left without treatment until death. Others were selected for transfer to killing facilities. Still others became subjects of medical experiments. Documented procedures at Ravensbrück included operations on healthy prisoners to simulate battlefield wounds, then testing experimental treatments. Bone, muscle, and nerve tissue were excised. Infections were introduced deliberately. Survival rates were recorded. The experiments targeted primarily Polish political prisoners, but Soviet women were also subjected to such procedures. The infirmary also served as a screening site for labor selections. Industrial contractors requiring workers requested fit prisoners. Camp medical staff examined candidates. Those passing inspection were transferred to subcamps and external work sites. Those failing remained in the main camp, where overcrowding and deteriorating conditions reduced survival probabilities. In late 1944 and early 1945, as Soviet and Allied forces closed in on Germany, Ravensbrück became a terminus for evacuated prisoners from camps in the east. The population surged beyond capacity. The infirmary could not accommodate the sick. Mortality spiked. A gas chamber was constructed at Ravensbrück in early 1945. Estimates suggest between 5,000 and 6,000 women were murdered there in the final months before liberation. Selections targeted the sick, the elderly, and those deemed unfit for evacuation. Soviet women in Ravensbrück faced elevated risk across these categories. Many arrived already weakened from prior captivity or forced labor. Language barriers limited their ability to navigate camp hierarchies. Stigma from guards and some fellow prisoners further marginalized them. The infirmary ledger recorded it all: operations, injections, transfers, deaths. The entries are clinical, brief, bureaucratic. They document institutionalized violence disguised as medicine. 1943 through April 1945, German industrial heartland and occupied territories. A munitions plant manager drafts a memo to the Reich Labor Ministry. He requires 500 additional foreign workers to meet production quotas. Rail disruptions have delayed deliveries. Food rations for current workers have been cut twice in 3 months. Absenteeism is rising. Output is falling. He needs more workers. The memo captures the contradiction of late-war labor policy. Industrial demand suggested that better provisioning would improve productivity, yet Allied bombing, transport breakdowns, and food scarcity across the Reich eroded the conditions necessary for survival. By 1943, Germany's war economy depended structurally on forced labor. Over 7 million foreign workers, POWs, Ostarbeiter, concentration camp prisoners, staffed farms, factories, mines, and construction sites. Without them, German war production would have collapsed earlier. Yet the system could not be sustained. Allied air raids destroyed factories, disrupted rail networks, and scattered production facilities. Food imports from occupied territories declined as partisan activity intensified and front lines shifted. Caloric intake for both German civilians and forced laborers fell steadily through 1944 and into 1945. For Soviet women in the labor system, late war conditions meant the marginal survival advantage of work assignments began to disappear. Rations dropped. Air raids killed workers in factories and barracks. Medical care, already minimal, became non-existent. Comparative statistics reveal the persistent policy gradient. Among Western Allied POWs held by Germany, American, British, Canadian, mortality stood at approximately 3.6%. Among Soviet POWs, mortality reached 57%. The difference was not accidental. Even in 1944, when labor shortages were most acute, Soviet workers received lower rations than Western European workers. They lived in more crowded barracks. They faced harsher punishments. They were treated as expendable. Camp conditions deteriorated universally in the final year of the war. At Ravensbrück, overcrowding reached crisis levels. Arriving transports from evacuated eastern camps brought thousands of additional prisoners. Food supplies could not keep pace. Disease spread unchecked. The SS began evacuating camps in the path of advancing Allied and Soviet forces. Ravensbrück, located north of Berlin, remained operational into April 1945. On 27th and 28th April, SS guards forced approximately 20,000 prisoners onto death marches heading northwest. Those too sick to walk remained behind. Soviet forces arrived on 30th April. They found roughly 3,000 prisoners still alive, many near death. For Soviet women who survived to liberation, whether from camps, labor sites, or death marches, the end of German captivity did not mean freedom. It meant transition to a different form of control. April through June 1945, Ravensbrück concentration camp, northern Germany, Allied displaced persons centers, a field registration desk. A Soviet liaison officer examines documents. He asks questions in Russian. The woman across from him answers. Name, date of birth, place of origin. How did you come to be here? The officer writes. He stamps a card. Nationality, status, processing category. Liberation came in stages. At Ravensbrück, SS guards fled on 29 April 1945. Soviet advance forces arrived the next day. They found a camp in chaos, sick and dying prisoners, no food, no medical supplies, bodies awaiting burial. In the weeks that followed, Soviet military authorities established control. They brought in medical teams, they organized food distribution, they began registering survivors for repatriation. Allied military governments, American, British, Soviet, established displaced persons camps across occupied Germany. The scale was immense. Millions of people had been displaced by the war, POWs, concentration camp survivors, forced laborers, refugees. For Soviet citizens, the process differed from that applied to Western Europeans. Soviet policy distinguished among several categories: former Red Army POWs, concentration camp survivors, civilian Ostarbeiter. Each category carried different implications. The interrogations were systematic. How were you captured? What was your unit? Did you surrender, or were you taken while unconscious? Did you work for the Germans willingly? Were you in contact with resistance groups? The questions probed for collaboration, for political reliability, for evidence of treasonous conduct. Order number 270, issued 16th August 1941 by Stalin as People's Commissar of Defense, shaped the framework. The order declared that Soviet soldiers must fight to the death. Those who surrendered were to be considered traitors. Their families would be deprived of state assistance. For Soviet women, the categories overlapped uncomfortably. A female medic captured while unconscious after her unit was overrun fit the POW category, but did Order 270. Applied to medical personnel, a woman conscripted as an Ostarbeiter from a village swept by German forces. Was she a victim or a collaborator? The registration cards captured only basic data: name, year, place, category. The cards could not contain the complexity of experience, the ambiguity of survival, the moral impossibility of the questions being asked. For many Soviet women, liberation at the wire gave way immediately to a second form of confinement: the interrogation room, the filtration camp, the prolonged uncertainty of return. 1945 through 1946, Soviet filtration camps and repatriation corridors from Germany eastward. A Soviet commission officer opens a file. He reviews interrogation reports, unit records, statements from fellow prisoners, medical examinations. He notes the findings. He stamps the file. Provereno, verified. Category assigned. The scale of Soviet repatriation was vast. By war's end, over 4 million Soviet citizens had been forcibly displaced into German-controlled territories. They included POWs, Ostarbeiter, concentration camp survivors, and civilians fleeing combat zones. The repatriation centers were not simple transit points, they were filtration sites. Every returnee underwent interrogation. The questions covered circumstances of capture, conduct during captivity, collaboration with German authorities, and contact with foreign intelligence services. The process sorted returnees into categories. Statistical samples from declassified Soviet archives provide approximate distributions. Roughly 58% were released to civilian life or remobilized into military service. Approximately 19% were assigned to labor battalions for reconstruction work. Smaller percentages were detained for further investigation or transferred to NKVD custody. The proportions varied by cohort. Former Red Army officers faced more intensive scrutiny than enlisted personnel. Men were more likely to be remobilized or sent to labor battalions. Women were more likely to be released, but those with political flags, party membership, partisan activity, identified as politicals by German authorities, faced harsher outcomes. The system operated on suspicion by default. Captivity itself was grounds for doubt. The Soviet state had invested enormous resources in promoting the narrative of heroic resistance. How, then, to explain surrender? For women, the interrogation process probed specific areas. Had they been coerced into sexual relationships with Germans? Had they accepted preferential treatment for collaboration? Had they informed on fellow prisoners? The questions assumed vulnerability, complicity, or both. Category assignment determined immediate fate. Those released received permits to return home. Those remobilized rejoined military units or were assigned to reconstruction brigades. Labor battalion assignments meant years of compulsory work on infrastructure projects, mines, or factories. Under military-style discipline, NKVD transfers led to imprisonment in the Gulag system or internal exile. The filtration files accumulated details from multiple sources. German camp records, when captured intact, were cross-referenced. Fellow returnees were questioned about each other. Discrepancies in accounts triggered extended detention. Soviet women comprised a significant share of returnees, but Soviet statistics rarely disaggregated data by sex. Gender-specific outcomes remain poorly documented in official sources. The NKVD filtration file was the documentary centerpiece of post-war sorting. It determined where a Soviet woman would live, what work she could perform, whether she could rejoin family, and how the state would regard her for years to come. 16th August 1941, Moscow. The order distributed to all Soviet military commands and political departments. A staff officer pins the text of Order Number 270 onto a command board. The order bears Stalin's signature as People's Commissar of Defense. Its language is unambiguous. Soviet soldiers must fight to the last. Commanders and political officers who surrender are traitors. Their families will be arrested. The full text reads in part, "Commanders and political officers who during battle tear off their insignia and desert to the rear or surrender to the enemy are to be considered malicious deserters, whose families are subject to arrest as families of deserters who have violated their oath and betrayed their motherland." The order specified consequences. Officers and political commissars who surrendered were to be destroyed by all available means. Artillery and airstrikes on their positions if necessary. Families of officers who surrendered would be arrested immediately. Families of rank-and-file soldiers who surrendered would be deprived of state benefits and assistance. Order 270 was issued in the desperate summer of 1941. German forces had encircled entire Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army personnel had been captured in the first weeks of the invasion. The Soviet leadership faced military catastrophe and sought to harden resistance through absolute prohibition of surrender. The order remained in force throughout the war. Its consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. It established a framework that defined captivity as treason, survival as suspect, and return as requiring proof of innocence. For Soviet women captured in military service, the order created impossible dilemmas. A medical orderly, overrun by German tanks while treating wounded, was she obligated to fight to the death? A radio operator whose unit was encircled? Should she have died rather than be captured? Post-war filtration applied Order 270's logic retroactively. Interrogators examined how each individual came to be captured. Wounded and unconscious was acceptable. Surrounded and out of ammunition was questionable. Any suggestion of voluntary surrender was grounds for punishment. After the war, the order's influence persisted in administrative practice. Personnel files noted captivity. The notation affected employment prospects, housing assignments, educational opportunities, and Communist Party membership. In the post-war decades, Soviet authorities rarely acknowledged the order's existence in public discourse. Official histories emphasized heroism and resistance. Stories of surrender, captivity, and filtration were suppressed. It was not until 1955, after Stalin's death, that partial reversals began. Khrushchev's government initiated reviews of wartime cases. Some former POWs had their records cleared. Restrictions on benefits were lifted for many veterans, but the process was incomplete and slow. For Soviet women who survived German camps and forced labor, Order 270 defined their relationship with the Soviet state upon return. They had survived conditions designed to kill them, yet their own government treated their survival as grounds for suspicion. 1941 through 1945, from capture in occupied Soviet territories through transit camps, labor sites, and concentration camps, to liberation and repatriation. A historian lays out overlapping records, German camp registries, labor office card files, Ravensbrück transport lists, Soviet repatriation ledgers, International Tracing Service documents. The fragments assembled reveal structured pathways. The system operated across multiple intersecting channels. Women captured by Wehrmacht or SS forces entered POW cages, gulags and stalags. There, they faced initial sorting. Some remained in camps, where mortality was highest in winter 1941 through 42. Others were diverted to labor assignments as the Reich's need for workers expanded from early 1942 onward. Parallel to the POW system, German civilian authorities conscripted Soviet women from occupied territories. These women were classified as Ostarbeiter, civilian forced laborers. They received identity cards, wore OST badges, and were transported to agricultural and industrial work sites across the Reich. By August 1944, over 2 million Soviet civilians labored in Germany. Women comprised nearly half. A third pathway led to the concentration camp system. Women identified as partisans, political functionaries, or security threats were transferred to camps, including Ravensbrück. Women who violated labor regulations, escape attempts, refusal of work assignments, infractions against racial laws, were also routed to camps for punishment. Quantification requires assembling data from disparate sources. German military records document approximately 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured during the war. By war's end, approximately 3.3 million, 57%, were dead. Western Allied POW mortality under German custody was approximately 3.6%. The differential reflected sustained policy. At Ravensbrück, nationality lists and memorial research place Soviet women at approximately 28,000 of roughly 132,000 total inmates, about 21%. The proportion makes Soviet women one of the largest national cohorts in the camp. For Ostarbeiter, German Labor Office statistics provide baselines. August 1944 records cite 2.1 million Soviet and 1.6 million Polish civilian laborers in the Reich. Women comprised a substantial share, with estimates ranging from 40 to 50%. For Soviet cohorts. Repatriation figures come from Soviet sources, declassified decades after the war. Approximately 4.2 million Soviet citizens were repatriated between 1945 and 1946. This total included both former POWs and civilian displaced persons. Statistical samples suggest roughly 58% were released or remobilized, 19% sent to labor battalions, with smaller shares detained or transferred to NKVD custody. Mortality comparisons reveal policy impact. Among Western Allied POWs, German authorities provided Geneva Convention protections, at least minimally. Red Cross parcels supplemented rations. Barracks offered shelter. Medical care, though limited, existed. Death rates remained low. For Soviet POWs, German authorities denied Geneva protections. Rations fell below subsistence. Shelter was inadequate or absent. Medical care was withheld. The result, majority mortality, with winter 1941 through 42 accounting for the largest death surge. For women in the system, survival probabilities varied by pathway. POW cages in winter 1941 through 42 had the highest mortality. Labor assignments from 1942 onward offered marginally better odds through regular rations and shelter. Concentration camps combined high mortality from disease, malnutrition, and selections with occasional survival through labor utility. Late war evacuations reversed earlier gains. The numbers anchor the history: 5.7 million captured, 3.3 million dead, 28,000 Soviet women at Ravensbrück, 2 million Soviet civilians in Reich labor, 4.2 million repatriated and filtered. The figures define the contours of experience at scale. 1945 through the 1960s, Soviet Union, survivor communities across Europe. A woman applies for housing in a Soviet city. The housing committee reviews her application. They check her personnel file. A notation appears. Was in captivity, 1942-1945. The committee denies the application. No explanation provided. Post-war Soviet policy toward former captives operated through administrative mechanisms rather than mass punishment. There were no systematic executions of returnees, no automatic imprisonment of all former POWs. Instead, the state applied differential access to benefits, employment, housing, and party membership. The personnel file annotation became the marker. Was in captivity appeared in employment records, military service files, and internal passports. The notation signaled to administrators that this individual required additional scrutiny, should be denied certain positions, might be ineligible for particular benefits. Veterans who had been POWs could be barred from rejoining the Communist Party. They faced obstacles accessing higher education. They were excluded from work requiring security clearances. They could be denied war pensions. The restrictions were not universal or uniform, but they were common enough to create a climate of stigma. For Soviet women who had survived German captivity, the stigma carried gender-specific dimensions. Cultural expectations held that women should have chosen death over dishonor. Captivity implied sexual vulnerability. The implication, rarely stated but widely understood, was that survival might have required compromises that made the survivor morally suspect. Women returning from Ostarbeiter labor faced questions about whether they had collaborated. Women returning from Ravensbrück faced questions about why they had been imprisoned. Medical orderlies captured while treating wounded faced questions about why they had not died with their units. Soviet historical memory of the war, as constructed in official discourse, emphasized heroism, resistance, and victory. Stories that did not fit the narrative, surrender, captivity, survival under coercion, were marginalized or suppressed. Veterans who attempted to discuss their experiences could be accused of slandering the Soviet state. The silence extended to documentation. Soviet archives recorded repatriation totals and broad categories, but rarely disaggregated data by sex. Research on the specific experiences of Soviet women in German captivity faced official discouragement. In Western archives, documentation survived because it served different institutional purposes. German records preserved evidence of labor deployment and camp populations for administrative reasons. Allied occupation authorities documented displaced persons for repatriation processing. International humanitarian organizations maintained files for tracing and relief purposes. The Arolsen archives, established to trace missing persons and document Nazi persecution, accumulated records from multiple sources: Ravensbrück transport lists, Ostarbeiter register shown cards, DP center records. The collections enabled reconstruction of pathways even where Soviet archives remained closed. After the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, declassification of some archival holdings improved access. Researchers gained permission to examine repatriation statistics, filtration protocols, and NKVD records. The documentation confirmed patterns long evident in survivor testimony: systematic interrogation, categorical suspicion, prolonged administrative punishment. Memorial organizations established by camp survivors preserved testimony and documentation. The Ravensbrück Memorial collected statements from survivors across many nations, including Soviet women. The testimonies provided personal detail that official records omitted. Yet gaps remain. Soviet official statistics on repatriation seldom broke down outcomes by sex. Mortality figures for Soviet POWs are debated, with estimates ranging from 3 to 3.5 million dead. Ravensbrück inmate totals vary depending on sources and definitions. The numbers cited: 5.7 million captured, 3.3 million dead, 28,000 Soviet women at Ravensbrück, represent best estimates synthesized from multiple data sets. What the archival record establishes beyond dispute is structure. German policy deliberately excluded Soviet POWs from Geneva protections, producing majority mortality. Soviet policy subjected returnees to filtration, producing prolonged administrative stigma. The intersection of these two state systems defined the pathways Soviet women traveled from capture through liberation and beyond. On 30th April 1945, Soviet forces arrived at Ravensbrück. The remaining prisoners were freed. Many Soviet women then traveled east toward homes they had not seen in years. They entered filtration camps. They answered interrogators' questions. They waited for category assignment. Liberation from German captivity did not end their ordeal. It transformed it. The personnel file notation "was in captivity" remained for decades. It marked women who had survived conditions designed to kill them. It signaled suspicion rather than recognition, administrative burden rather than honor. Only in the mid-1950s, after Stalin's death, did policy begin to shift. Only decades later did full acknowledgement begin to emerge. The documentary record now permits reconstruction. 3 numeric anchors define the baseline: approximately 3.3 million Soviet POW deaths under German custody, roughly 28,000 Soviet women among Ravensbrück inmates, and over 4 million Soviet citizens repatriated and filtered after liberation. The figures are not final, but they are grounded in surviving documentation from German, Soviet, and international archives. For Soviet women captured by Nazi forces between 1941 and 1945, the historical significance lies not in individual heroism or tragedy, though both were abundant, but in the systematic nature of the violence they faced and the bureaucratic mechanisms that documented their passage through two systems of control. The archives preserve the evidence. The numbers anchor the history. Between 1941 and 1945, Soviet women captured by Nazi forces moved through a system designed for exploitation and neglect, documented across POW, civilian labor, and women's camp records. The mortality differential, 3.6% for US and UK POWs versus 57% for Soviet POWs, quantifies policy impact. Ravensbrück's nationality lists place Soviet women at approximately 28,000 of roughly 132,000 inmates. Arelson and US HMM sources document the scale of civilian forced labor. Over 2 million Soviet civilians in the Reich by August 1944. Soviet repatriation processed approximately 4.2 million returnees through filtration systems that sorted them into release, remobilization, labor battalions, or detention. On 30th of April 1945, the vanguard of the Soviet army arrived at Ravensbrück. The last prisoners were freed the following day. Many Soviet women then entered a second system of scrutiny at home. The archives, German records of capture and labor deployment, camp registries, transport lists, repatriation ledgers, preserve the structure and scale of what occurred. The numbers do not tell individual stories, but they establish the framework within which millions of individual stories unfolded. If you value fact-based military history grounded in archives and statistics, consider supporting the channel.